everybody here okay? Agile is not a word that you typically associate with higher education. I think that's something that's kind of that truism about, even John Katzman mentioned, it's hard to steer the ship. I've been covering this space for nearly 20 years for the Chronicle of Higher Education and other people, and when you talk about colleges, you just kind of don't see them. You know, you see them as bastions of traditionalism and kind of moving slowly. It's almost a core value. But what happens when now we have the digital tools and the digital space kind of moving at a breakneck speed, and there's almost a clash of cultures between the kind of values, the core values of traditional higher education and the core values of kind of the technology startup ecosystem that's you know, so much of what's going on here at CES. And I think, you know, this is an interesting time, and the question is, can colleges adapt, and should they, and how is all this going to play out? And so I'm excited. This panel, we're going to talk about agile learning, and as was said, kind of the developer's attitude, but it's kind of also really about culture in an important way. And we have a great group of folks up here. I'm Jeff Young again from the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I want to quickly plug, we just started kind of announcing at CES, the Chronicle started a project called the Relearning Project. If you go to chronicle.com/relearning, we're kind of doing a deep dive about what is this new education landscape and covering issues like the ones at this session today. But of course, more importantly, we have our panelists here. Andrew Smith-Lewis is founder of Cerego, which is an adaptive learning platform for education, and of course uses the Agile philosophy in important ways there. John Stowe is the CEO of Dev Bootcamp, and they, of course, will teach you a course on Agile learning, but more importantly, uses that philosophy for developing all of its products. And last but not least, Jan Plass from NYU, Chair of Digital Media and Learning Sciences. So we have a learning scientist with us, and he's kind of an island of this style of development within that traditional higher ed space. So again, I'm going to just kind of try to lead a conversation. Hopefully we'll have maybe time for a couple questions in the end. Try to keep it moving. We joked that we should sort of stop and assess how it's going in the middle, but we can see if we'd use the Agile method within our own panel. I think it'll be helpful, though, to start with the definition, right? Maybe some of you are like, Agile learning. John, do you want to talk for a minute about, like, quick definition? And, excuse me, John, not Andrew. John, would you give us teach us, what is Agile learning, and what, you know, give us a quick shorthand, and how is it used at Dev Bootcamp?
Sure, yeah. So Agile learning is adapted from the idea of Agile software development, which, you know, if you go back to the origins of that, it goes all the way back to the early 70s, actually, and thinking about how large systems were created at big companies. But in the 80s, when the Agile Manifesto was created, if you go back and look at that, people like Jim Highsmith were talking about the idea of customer-centric software development that was happening on the fly and was, over a period of time, adapting and iterating to the needs of the customer in a better way. It was a collaborative process. It involved a lot of different people. And if you take that and translate that to education, what you end up with is a more learner-centric education that's adaptive and iterative, so that you're constantly improving upon what it is that you're working with the student to learn. And so when we formed Dev Bootcamp, what we did was we basically said Agile everything. Everything about this program is going to be Agile, and we're going to use and support tools that are going to help to provide that kind of agility, that sort of flexibility and adaptiveness to every student that comes through our doors.
So I think it'll kind of help add on to that, Andrew, if you could tell us about how this is used in practice for Cerego. Like, how does, can you give a specific example maybe of an improvement that gets made, or the cultural way that you're using Agile?
Sure. How many people in the audience think they understand what Agile development means?
Okay, so there's a pretty good
number.
Good number, yeah.
So for me, one key concept, adding to what John says, I think of the idea of little and often as a sort of a magic recipe, both for learning and for Agile development. So at our shop, we operate in sprints, and we have this philosophy of constant deployment of code. So in some cases, as often as twice or 3 times a day, we're deploying code. So this idea of discrete, attainable projects that can be released very, very quickly is very key. And I think it's also a good recipe for learning, right? So how often have we heard students say, I'm just going to study for 10 minutes? But really, that's a very effective methodology for approaching education. If you know what you need to do and you can do it on your mobile device and you can get it done in 10 or 15 minutes and you're on your way, that's a really good thing. So for us, little and often is a real key approach to Agile.
So making those improvements to the software and to the sort of the learning platform.
Yeah, constantly. And I'll tell you, at first it's interesting. So my background, I came from an environment in Japan where we were the complete opposite, where we did deploys a couple times a year at best, unless you were doing bug fixes.
Right.
And switching to this sort of model where you're constantly deploying was a big shift. It's also interesting to see, because we have customers who are traditional. In some places, we work with a lot of MOOCs, but then we work with traditional publishers. And when you tell your publishers that you're going to push code that's going to impact students a couple times a week, a lot of them freak out until they start to see that this is super cool because things come up and they can be dealt with iteratively and quickly. And you don't have to wait weeks and months for this big waterfall of development to be pushed out to affect products.
And that has so many changes that you kind of have to reorient yourself.
Exactly. So this little incremental changes makes it easy for people using the system to stay up with it, as opposed to, as you just said, all of a sudden, kaboom, the system is different. And how many of us have had that with software that we know and love, and one day the damn thing is just very, very different than when it was the day before. And that's not fun.
Sure. And Jan, at NYU, you know, I think some people in the audience are probably at a traditional higher ed place where this all sounds dreamy, maybe. But what kind of obstacles do you face when you're trying to have an attitude like this toward, you know, making games for learning or other projects you're working on as a learning scientist there?
Very good question. And before I answer that, I wanted to actually take a bit of an issue, with the characterization of higher education as being completely the opposite of Agile.
Oh, good.
And
let's do it.
And I would like to say that, for instance, the learner focus and the learner as the centerpiece of what we're doing has been the characteristic for higher education for a long time.
Sure.
And that approaches of iteration and improvement and working in teams and you know, high kind of turnover of certain products has also been part of some types of education, mostly in graduate education. So it's not completely foreign to us on certain levels. It's not so much embedded on the higher administrative levels and on the curricular level that are rather, you know, consistent over time. And there are some reasons for that. In the work that I do, we build simulations and games for learning, and we study how well they work and how they need to be designed to be effective for learning, and look at the data that come out of that, like panels before I've discussed. We use an agile approach to that because I believe very strongly that in software development, that's exactly the method to use. And that has gotten me thinking about how you can actually do that in the classroom and at other levels where we haven't approached that before. And the barriers come from all different sides. The one is we are accredited institutions. We have oversight that will actually say, yes, you are allowed to award a degree and you are not in certain cases. And those are policy barriers that are very hard to fight. If anybody has ever tried to change a state government's mind about university regulations, you'll know how hard that is. Within the university, we have barriers because many faculty members are very comfortable with the way they're doing things. And some of them do agile things, and others don't. And every faculty member, one of their core beliefs is that the way they teach is the best way that can be possibly taught, which in part is why we're there, right? So that's what we're there for at the university. And so there are levels. The third level is from the students. So the idea that in some cases we have very willing students who don't mind that in the beginning of the course the syllabus is still kind of in flux. That is not the case for many of the students that you see at the university level. And so there are barriers from the students, from the faculty member, from the university administration, from the policymakers, and to cut through them is very difficult.
Well, kind of a follow-up question to that, actually. I mean, I sometimes wonder, covering this area, why colleges don't do more, like NYU and other traditional universities, don't do more of the same kind of platforms that are being developed, or programs like that Bootcamp. Why don't they do this more themselves, or have this, you know, sort of do some of the things that's been going on in the ed tech space, which is really booming, ed tech startups, why not do that in-house? Why are they, and why do they partner with places like 2U? No offense to that, but just this, why not build it themselves rather than kind of have to go to the for-profit sector or the software development sector? Because once upon a time, colleges actually built their own software and kind of, maybe helped start the internet really as we know it and all this, there was a whole different era. But now, that's, the colleges are kind of playing catch up in a lot of ways. Why not? Why is more of it not coming out of places like NYU or colleges?
All right, again, in a way it is coming out of colleges
Sure.
and university by us having done the research, right? And then our graduates and the people who actually read our papers then hopefully build on that and come up with the great ideas of how to build the next generation learning platform. But you have seen some pretty spectacular, I don't want to say failures as much as attempts by universities to do that, and then the realization afterwards that that was just not what the core business of a university is. The MIT Open Courseware approach and initiative, very successful, but a huge drain on finances.
Right.
Very few organizations can actually afford doing that. Sakai, as an initiative of universities to build their own course management platform, very clearly showed what the potential is, but also the shortcoming of having not-for-profit organizations try to have a platform out that is.
Yeah, so Sakai was this
competing.
community source
Right.
effort by multiple big universities to try to build their own CMS.
Right, and so it's become very clear to most of us that what we can do is we can help guide the development of that. We can see that our research results are reflected in those environments when they're being built, but that it really is something for a for-profit organization to really have a polished product that also can be maintained and brought up to date. So we're partnering with outside vendors, and that is a very difficult thing to maneuver as well, because the number one actually need that we have is not so much the vendor, but the funding they bring with them to develop those shiny course materials, those high quality course materials that often are the result of those course designs. So there are millions that are going into the development of courses, and that
These are basically universities building an online program out and basically partnering with a place that helps put some of the cash in.
Right. So under the pressure of being agile and of responding to the needs of the market and of answering a lot of the needs of the industry that were also outlined in the panel earlier, where now industry starts certifying their own and credentialing their own workers. Many universities are attempting to partner with the industry to build certain types of degree programs that lend themselves to do that. And so what we're doing at NYU, we're essentially having this let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of approach. We do that, we fully outsource the development, then we partially outsource development in an a la carte kind of menu style where we just have the assets built, but the rest is designed by us. And then we have fully internally developed projects, which is what my program is working on. So we're doing what a university should be doing, is we're attempting different things, and then we're collecting the data on that, and then in the end, we'll have some results on what worked and under what conditions and for what kind of courses.
Well, and of course, I always wonder, could this go kind of too far in a way, and maybe there is something, that might be lost if we just kind of did all this sort of big change to the culture of higher education as we know it. And I guess, Andrew, do you think there's any chance that it could go too far in kind of, or is there any area of the university where it may not be a fit, or in some disciplines maybe, or is this something that really can be anywhere?
I don't really know. I think that's a good question. I don't know. What do you think, John? I'm going to just pass it over to you.
I look at what we do at DVC, and I think about that being applied to multiple verticals. So give some examples. We have, if you think about coding as a new form of literacy,
right.
and you think about kind of what we would describe as sort of multidisciplinary practices or careers that exist. Like if you go to hire somebody in bioinformatics today, you're looking for somebody with a life science background who has an information systems and computing skill set as well. That typically, previously, has been something that required a postdoc degree to do.
Sure.
You could look at that for data science. That's why one of the reasons why the career is such in high demand right now. And you can look at it in machine learning. You can look at it in any number of kind of high-level professions upon which coding is sort of a foundation layer. If you start to look at those verticals and you think that this probably previously required somewhere between 4 and 5 years of additional education on top of an undergraduate degree, and then you look at the opportunities that exist in these spaces, it becomes very clear that there are many disciplines for which this sort of education will proliferate. And I think there's, the broad experience of an undergraduate degree. Most of our students have a degree, a 4-year degree, but it's in something completely different from code development.
Right.
It's in sociology, or it's in one of the other soft side disciplines, and yet they probably somewhere along the line found out that they weren't good at math, quote unquote. And it's in that moment that we feel like we can say to them, like, actually, it's not that you weren't good at math, it's that you weren't taught math in the right way. And let's talk about what that looks like when it's applied. So I think Agile learning will find its way back into the traditional education system, but we'll see more and more Agile programs that evolve to meet the sort of job demands and requirements of the world we're headed into. In the next 5 years, it's going to be enormous.
I would have given the exact same answer. I just want to make that
For the
very
record,
clear.
sir.
That's exactly what I would have said. I think also it's not like this isn't like a new religion, and it's not black and white. There's a zone in the middle. Agile learning doesn't mean that you have to take all the principles. There's the Agile Learning Manifesto, which is wonderful, but that's a little bit, I think it's going too far. You can take certain principles into the classroom, and I think it'd be hard-pressed to find topics that couldn't benefit from some of the advantages of cherry picking what works for your students and for the way you teach and for the content.
Well, for all of you, what are some, so let's say, you guys are talking from kind of working in a system that kind of has embraced Agile, but what if you're at a place that doesn't do that? Or you're not even in charge, if you're at a university or at a company that isn't already doing this Agile approach. Are there pieces, like you suggest, are there pieces that, or kind of habits of mind or something that people in the audience could kind of take back as a takeaway from something that kind of they could think about?
Well, to me, the learner-centric approach and the approach to say, let's do something for a certain period of time, but then let's really question and validate whether we're doing it the right way. And not just by us doing it to someone, but by involving the learner in this process. That, to me, is the key component, and that is a very easy takeaway for anybody who's teaching, right? So it changes the approach from the instructor necessarily just being the sage on the stage to the facilitator and somebody who's part of the learning process. In the learning sciences, we've been preaching that for, 30, 40, 50 years, right? I'm really happy to see this finally getting a better name and maybe more traction that way. But that's a very important takeaway point as far as I'm concerned.
I love it. You've been doing this since before it was cool. That's good. John, you were telling in a discussion we had beforehand, it sounded like you guys really enacted this at your own at Bootcamp. So could you describe just really quickly like what the process of like reviewing how it's going and having that happen on a concrete level? Because some people in the audience probably know this all too well, but I think for others it might be helpful.
So I'll give a few examples. DBC is based on sort of 3 pillars of learning: a set of hard skills that you need to get a job. Those are largely programming skills, but they also work with project methodology and development. A set of soft skills, so interpersonal skills, starting with like intrapersonal skills. So we spend a lot of time talking about what is your inner critic? What are the barriers that hold you back from being able to be your best self and when you come to work every day? And we do things like meditation and we practice yoga. I mean, that's part of the curriculum. So that leads to a set of metacognitive skills. All of our learners come in and they pair up twice a day. In each of those pairing sessions, they pair with different people all the time. After every pairing session, they're giving feedback on the person they just paired with. We have this tool, it's called Feedbackinator. And basically, you provide sort of a set of scores about the person you just paired with. One person will navigate, one person will drive. They're working on code challenges the whole time they're there. And you're putting into practice immediately the things that you've just learned both hard skills and soft skills in that moment. And then if the feedback is actionable and specific and kind, those are the things that we're looking for, the feedback will be also meta-reviewed by other people within the cohort. So once it's been validated or vetted, then that feedback is delivered to your pair. So you constantly know how you're doing. And then one of the other tenets of Agile is that you do, as you mentioned, you're doing daily stand-ups. You're constantly looking at what's happening. And so that same feedback is given to the facilitators, the training teachers that are part of the program, who are practicing engineers. And so every day, at the end of the day, there's a stand-up, informal feedback is given, and then that same feedbackinator process is run with the facilitators. So they're constantly getting
So with the
feedback
students kind of giving this feedback to the professors in real time, so to speak, while it's going on.
Absolutely. So you can, at any given moment, you can go in and see, on a heat map, how am I doing as a facilitator of this group? Where am I nailing it? Where am I missing? And then you, as a student, you have the ability to look into that as well. And I think it's that, along with things like we do NPS scores, Net Promoter Scores, several times through the program.
Sure.
Is this something you would recommend to someone else? And a very simple touch base like that, a little data point, is something that gives you a sense of how's this cohort functioning, taking the temperature of that learning group as they're going through the process.
And that does seem different, although, Jan, your point is well taken about, colleges have certainly always taken the students seriously and been student-centered in some way. But some of these kind of cultural processes seem a little bit unusual compared to traditional courses.
Compared to certain traditional courses, absolutely. I mean, this is an enormously interesting and innovative approach, certainly for developers and training the kind of technical skills, but also the soft skills that go with that. And I completely agree that we need to look at those kind of use cases and ask ourselves, how can we improve our own learning offerings as a whole system? And the problem with the university is that if I come up with a great way of teaching my new courses, my colleague in biology will look at that and will say, has nothing to do with the way I teach. And my colleague in the medical school will say the same, and the other one in the business school will say the same again. And so what we're facing really is a multitude of voices and of opinions and approaches where you can model it, you can show what the benefits are, and then people will have to make it their own by looking at what the potential is. And so my main other point as a takeaway point is, and I'm kind of thinking about this panel, thought Agile Learning is going to save education when we're doing it right. Oh, wasn't it Games for Learning that was going to save education just a few years back? And before there was Multimedia for Learning. And I actually date back as far as when I was in graduate school, it was Laserdiscs for Learning. And so if we...
that was probably big at CES.
That was big
right?
at CES at the time,
Laserdiscs.
right? And so if we're not careful, we're going down the same path. And to me, the question to ask is, what problem are we trying to fix?
Right.
What is the problem that we're trying to fix? And then look at the multitude of methods that we can use to fix them. And Agile Learning is definitely one of them. And platforms like Cerego that Andrew's company is developing is certainly one of the tools to do that with.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that now everybody needs to go home and do Agile Learning in every aspect of what they're doing. And so that to me is the important takeaway point.
Yeah. Andrew, did you want to add any kind of takeaways of things people can take back from the Agile mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking when John was speaking, part of what I was thinking about is the approach to testing and assessment. So,
Sure.
the traditional approach is that we sort of infrequently test people and we use those tests to kind of grade where people are, but it's not, it sort of pits the student against the faculty, and it's not used
Right.
as a means of improving and iterating in the process, right? So if you take the approach of little and often, if you're able to have these more frequent touch points
Right.
where students aren't pressured to feel that they have to regurgitate an entire semester's worth of content on a final, but week by week can kind of check in and ensure that they're in the right place, and then the faculty doesn't have to so rigidly adhere to a syllabus and can think about what needs to be modified for that group based on that feedback. So if you have the previous panel was talking about data. If you have the right data, it's not just data exhaust, but it's actionable insights into where people are, then you can have this iterative model of moving the whole team forward as opposed to, hey, we're going to give you a midterm and a final.
These high-stakes tests.
Right, and you pass, you fail, you fail. Well, what about the range in between? What about the key things that you're missing?
Did you want to answer that, John?
I would
and then we're going to
echo
open
that.
it up for questions after that.
I mean, I think you know, years ago, I was a CTO at Thomson Learning before it became Cengage. And we had this large monolithic learning platform that we developed at that time. And I think, you know, access to that was somewhat limited. It was something that happened over a period of a semester. Today, there are so many tools, and they're micro tools. They're not necessarily these large platforms in the cloud. They're micro tools that are designed to enable learning on the fly in a very specific way. And there's so many sort of resources that can help this to happen in a very quick way. I think, you know, we're piloting Cerego, for instance. I think that's another one of those little touch point tools that's going to give you some real indicators about the performance of somebody on the fly. And a lot of that is actually self-performance. It's how am I doing? To a point that you made earlier, Jan, I think, and this is really interesting, is it's the institutions and particularly the accrediting bodies that have to sort of catch up to this. The rest of the world is there. And so recently, the state of California, in trying to license bootcamps, and we went through that process with the state, they looked at their licensing process, and our curriculum iterates every 3 weeks. We're on a rolling cohort model, so every 3 weeks a new group of students come in and start the program, and the curriculum evolves based on the feedback of the previous 3 weeks. So the state of California didn't know how to process that. They were like, well, curriculum changes should be a 6-month process. It needs to be reviewed by peers. This is a big deal. And they formed a task force, actually, to interview us and a couple of other of these schools to understand how we're developing the curriculum based on the feedback from employers and students. And they've actually now, they're moving to enact laws that will support the sort of agility of curriculum development and evolution. I think that'll set a tone for the rest of the country.
It gets back to
it's changing.
It gets back to a question that was asked first thing in the morning about, is this really going to be a disruption of the culture of higher education, or is it that's bigger than just one person, one classroom, or classroom by classroom change, or is there something bigger? And if you start to involve the accreditors and you start to involve the policymakers, obviously you're talking about a bigger structural change. Yeah.
And just to give you an example of how difficult this is, so if you had someone who learns coding or technical professions, or like in our case, learning sciences, that's one thing. If you walked into your doctor's office tomorrow and you saw by chance their certificate on the wall and you noticed, oh, they got their degree in an online college that uses Agile Learning, and you know what that means, and you realize their curriculum might have changed over time and they might have included certain things and not other things, how would you feel about that, right? So it's not just the accrediting bodies, it's also the public perception of how certain types of professions are supposed to be prepared that make this so hard to say it works everywhere. But that doesn't mean we can't have it work anywhere. And so that's the dilemma for a university that's trying to cover all different kind of subjects and professions.
But the medical, I agree with you, it'd be a little intimidating to see that in terms of a doctor, but the body of medical knowledge doubles every 2 years, right? And if the approach isn't agile, then what are the odds that that person that's treating you has the best information?
I love it. If we could poll the audience, who wants to go to the Agile doctor or the old-fashioned doctor? I think we're almost out of time, but I'd love to at least get one question. The people with mics are out there. Does someone want to be the first to raise their hand out there? Unless there's there's one here in the third row, fourth row. Will you grab the mic and tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Chris. I work for the Daily Telegraph in London, and we're looking at education as something that we're very interested in getting into. But my question to you is, when the students are assessing the professor or the teacher on a constant basis, how do you stop that from becoming an overly bureaucratic process? Oh, I've got another sheet to fill in. How does that work? How does that become fun rather than a burden?
Right, so everything that's delivered to the student while they're there, our entire curriculum sits in GitHub. So somebody mentioned GitHub earlier as it's a code repository. For us, it's essentially our LMS, and so the code that runs the Feedbackinator process and the feedback tools that we use also are linked in and part of that repository. So it's when you're finished with a day of coding at DBC, you simply click a link, it pops open a screen, and we ask questions, actually 3 simple questions about your experience in the day. I think one of the things we've learned over time is like in some ways, less is more in this. And if a student feels strongly about the experience that they had, we always give them an ability to write that out and say it. I think more importantly, we also find that people, and we see this in online behavior, people in an online environment in an anonymized fashion are more likely to be harsher and more critical.
Like Rate My Professor is out there if anyone,
Yeah,
anyone
great
teaches knows
example.
this.
Great example. So in a situation where the student's name is going to be used and it's likely that the teacher is going to want to follow up with them and talk to them about their feedback,
Right.
the feedback is a lot more thoughtful, and it is, back to my earlier point, actionable, specific, and kind. And I think that's the kind of environment we want to cultivate. That's what we want our graduates to go out and do when they're employed, and that's the kind of workplaces we want them to perpetuate. So we want to create that within the environment.
All right. Well, I think we've gone over time, but help me thank this panel here, everybody, and thanks for sticking around.